It's a man named Grebennikov from Russia. Grebennikov was kind of a non-conventional scientist. He was an entomologist, did a lot of work with bugs, entomology.
He was a real scientist, published, credentialed, respected by his peers. And then he claimed he discovered something inside the wings of a beetle, a hidden force that could cancel gravity itself. He said he built a machine from it, a silent, engineless platform that lifted him off the ground and carried him across the Russian countryside faster than anything with a motor. He flew it, he wrote, with just his shadow moving across the fields below.
He found a certain bug that didn't fly, it levitated.
He published every detail, the physics, the flights, the silence, under his own name. And then he disappeared. And when people went looking for the machine after his death, there was nothing. No device, no blueprints, no witnesses. Just a book and a question nobody has been able to answer since. The man at the drawing table. Picture him in the early 1950s, bent over a wooden desk, a fine brush in his hand, drawing the veins of a bee's wing with the patience of a monk illuminating scripture. Viktor Stepanovich Grebennikov was born on April 23, 1927, in Simferopol, the city now located in Crimea, and eventually settled in Novosibirsk, the industrial and academic heart of Western Siberia. He spent most of his professional life as a researcher at the Siberian branch of the All-Union Academy of Agricultural Sciences. This is Grebennikov, holding what all this led to. He looks like an artist. He goes out into the country and he takes his paints and his supplies. It's like an artist's set, and it folds up. So normally it unfolds, and it's got all the palettes and all. His field was entomology, the science of insects. He studied how they fed, how they moved, how they interacted with crops and soil and each other. Over decades, he built a natural history museum at his institute from specimens he personally collected across Siberia. He illustrated his own research papers with drawings so precise they looked like engineering blueprints. He was not a fringe figure. He was not a garage inventor. He was a credentialed researcher with a career, a publication record, and colleagues who took him seriously. That matters enormously for what comes next. What he found under the microscope. Around 1988, Grebennikov was examining the chitinous shell of a beetle under a microscope when he noticed something unexpected in the architecture of its surface. He was looking at microstructures, repeating geometric patterns, layered cellular cavities, precise angles nested inside each other at a scale invisible to the human eye. The structures were real. That part is not in dispute. Insect exoskeletons really are extraordinary. Researchers in biomimicry have spent decades studying them for principles applicable to aerospace materials and lightweight armor. The biological engineering in a beetle shell is, by any measure, remarkable. Grebennikov had found something genuinely interesting. And here is where it gets strange. He claimed the structures were doing something that no biology textbook accounts for. Grebennikov discovered something he called a cavity structural effect. And it's basically what we're talking about with tubes and the frequencies that cancel themselves out, and the way they interact with biological and physical material. He proposed that the geometric arrangement of those microscopic cavities was generating a physical field, not magnetic, not electrical, something he believed had never been identified or named. He called it the cavity structural effect. He reported that when he held his hand near a dense concentration of these structures, he could feel an unusual pressure. Not heat, not static, a force. He described plants growing differently near them. He described animals behaving oddly in their presence. He noted changes in his own perception of time. None of this appeared in any peer-reviewed journal. None of it was submitted for independent verification. All of it lived in his private notebooks. But he believed it. He believed it enough to take the next step. And the next step is the part that nobody has been able to explain. If you want to keep going down this rabbit hole with us, and you do, hit subscribe. We find the stories that got buried. He said he built it. In his 1997 self-published book, My World, Viktor Grebennikov described what he had made. He wrote that by stacking and arranging the chitinous wing cases of certain beetles, large numbers of them, positioned in precise configurations that maximize the cavity structural effect. He had created something that pushed back against gravity itself. He described building a portable, foldable platform, something he could stand on. He wrote that when the structure was correctly assembled, it rose silently. No engine, no fuel, no moving parts, just the geometry of insect wings layered in a pattern he had spent years working out. And then he described flying it. He wrote in the first person, in the past tense, the way a man describes something that happened to him on a Tuesday. In his book, he described rising above the grass and accelerating away from the city into the open countryside. Fields, forests, and roads passed below him. He wrote that he was flying at roughly 1.5 meters of altitude and increasing speed. The silence, he said, was complete. The air around him was motionless, and looking down, he could see the shadow of his invisible device moving across the grass below. Just his shadow, alone, moving fast across the field. Think about that for a moment. Just his shadow alone, moving fast across the field. He described the platform as capable of reaching extreme speeds, stopping instantly, changing direction with no inertial resistance. He described becoming invisible to observers on the ground at certain altitudes, not because he was hidden, but because the device he believed bent light or distorted perception in its vicinity. He described the platform as difficult to photograph because of what he called time distortion, a localized warping of time near the device that he believed caused photographs to come out blurry or fail to expose correctly. He included photographs in his book. They are blurry. He flew, he wrote, across the fields and forests of the Novosibirsk region. He described the look of Siberia from above, the quality of the light, the feel of cold air, the silence that wrapped around him at altitude. He wrote about it the way someone writes about something they have genuinely felt in their body. You want it to be true. That is the honest response to reading it. But here is where the story turns, and the turn is what the title is really about. What vanished? Grebennikov died on April 28, 2001 in Novosibirsk. He was 74 years old. His death was not sudden or mysterious. He was an elderly man at the end of a long life. He was not silenced. He was not arrested. He was not erased from any record. He died the way most people die, and the people who knew him knew he was gone. But when researchers and enthusiasts went looking for what he had described, the platform, the schematics, the laboratory records, the evidence of the thing he claimed had changed his life, they found nothing. No prototype, not in his estate, not in the institute, not in any archive. No engineering drawings detailed enough to reconstruct anything. No colleague who had witnessed a flight. No witness from the Novosibirsk region who stepped forward to say they had watched a man rise silently from the ground on a platform made of beetle wings. The photographs in his book could not be verified. The flights he described matched no flight record, no radar trace, no account from anyone on the ground. This is the disappearance the title is pointing to. And it is stranger in some ways than if the man himself had vanished. Because Viktor Grebennikov was present. He was there, he wrote about it, he published it, he put his name on it, and then he died. And the only evidence that any of it ever existed disappeared with him. Not him, the proof. That is what vanished, and no one has ever explained why. The physics problem. Nobody likes to talk about here is what mainstream science says about levitation. Stated plainly, there are known ways to make objects rise against gravity. Aerodynamic lift moves air over a wing's surface to create a pressure differential. Buoyancy makes a volume less dense than the surrounding medium. Electromagnetic levitation suspends conductive objects in controlled magnetic fields. Acoustic levitation holds small objects using focused sound pressure. Every one of these mechanisms is fully understood. Everyone has been independently reproduced. Everyone is currently in commercial use somewhere on the planet. What Grebennikov described is none of these. He proposed that the geometric arrangement of biological material, chitinous insect wing cases, could produce a field that directly counteracted gravitational attraction through a mechanism that has no recognized physical basis. For that to be true, the entire current model of gravity would need to be wrong in a very specific way. The gap in that model would need to exist precisely at the scale of insect wing microstructures. And every gravitational measurement ever conducted, including instruments sensitive enough to detect the gravitational pull of a small mountain, would need to have missed it entirely. That is not impossible. Physics has been revised before, but revision requires evidence, reproducible, independently verified, testable evidence. Grebennikov produced none. And here is the part that sits uncomfortably. He was a trained scientist. He knew that. He knew what evidence meant. And he published his account anyway, in a book with his name on it, without a single controlled experiment to support the core claim. Nobody has ever fully answered the question of why. Why the story spread and what that tells you. Grebennikov's book circulated in near-complete obscurity until the early 2000s, when English translations of excerpts began appearing on forums dedicated to alternative science and fringe physics. The story had everything those communities look for: verified credentials, a dramatic claim, a dead subject who could no longer speak for himself, and a Soviet backdrop that carries its own atmosphere of hidden knowledge. The Soviet Union really did classify research. The Cold War really did produce suppressed programs. Entire branches of Soviet science were hidden from the West for decades. That historical reality exists, and it makes the idea of suppressed anti-gravity research feel more plausible than it would otherwise. That's the trap, and it's a carefully constructed one, even if nobody constructed it on purpose. The documented suppression of military technology by a state with clear strategic reasons to keep it secret is one thing. The claimed suppression of a revolutionary device built by an entomologist at an agricultural research institute, a device the state apparently didn't notice, didn't classify, and left no trace of confiscating, is a different thing entirely. One is historical fact, the other is an explanation for an absence. An absence is not evidence. By the mid-2000s, Grebennikov had become a fixture of alternative physics discussions. By the YouTube era, his story had been rendered into dozens of videos that treated the blurry photographs as significant documentation, narrated his first-person flight descriptions as eyewitness testimony, and quietly transformed his natural death at 74 into the dramatic, unresolved disappearance the algorithm rewards. The story grew because stories always grow when no one with the facts is in the room. What science actually made of it? Let's be precise about this, because precision matters here. Researchers who specifically examined Grebennikov's claims found nothing in them that merited serious scientific investigation. The cavity structural effect has no recognized counterpart in physics, chemistry, or materials science. Insect wing microstructures are actively and seriously studied in biomimicry, materials engineering, and structural biology, and they are genuinely remarkable for their aerodynamic and mechanical properties. But nothing in that literature, across decades of research, suggests any interaction with gravitational force. Not a hint, not a footnote, not an anomaly worth a second look. The biological effects Grebennikov described near the cavity structures, the plants that grew differently, the animals that behaved oddly, the personal sensations of force, are entirely consistent with what psychology calls observer expectancy effects. When a person deeply expects a result and is simultaneously conducting the observation, they tend to find the result. This is not stupidity. It is a universal feature of human perception, so well documented that the entire apparatus of controlled, blinded experiments was designed specifically to filter it out. Grebennikov conducted no blinded experiments, no controlled conditions, no independent replication. The most honest scientific interpretation is that he was a genuinely skilled naturalist who noticed real structural properties in insect exoskeletons, built a theoretical framework around those observations that the evidence could not support, and then followed that framework further than the data could go. This happens in science. It does not require dishonesty. It requires only the very human desire to have found something important. a desire that every researcher who has ever cared about their work has felt. No one has ever reproduced the cavity structural effect under controlled conditions. That's the part nobody talks about. Not in 60-plus years of insect biomechanics research, not once. The question that will not close here is what remains after you strip away the conspiracy framing and the YouTube dramatics. A man who knew how to observe carefully, who had spent his life learning to see things others missed, claimed he found something in the structure of insect wings that nobody before him had noticed, and that it led him to build a machine that flew. He described the flights in specific, sensory, first-person detail. He published those descriptions in a book with his name on it. Then he died, and the machine was never found, and the schematics were never found, and the witnesses never came forward. That is not a hoax. Hoaxes are designed for audiences. He self-published in Russian in 1997 for what appears to have been a very small readership, with no apparent intent to become a viral mystery. Whatever he was doing when he wrote those pages, performing for strangers on the internet, was not it. So what was it? The honest answer is, we do not know. He may have believed every word. Human perception is capable of constructing experiences that feel entirely real and leave no external trace. He may have been writing something closer to visionary speculation, what he imagined might be possible, rendered in the grammar of personal memory. Naturalists of his training and era often move between close observation and interpretive imagination with more fluidity than laboratory science permits. What he did not leave behind is evidence. And without evidence, the claim cannot be resolved. It cannot be confirmed, it cannot be cleanly disproven. It simply sits at the edge of what the scientific method can address. Too detailed to dismiss as careless, too unverified to accept as fact. A real man, an unreal machine. Before the platform, there was the museum. Before the museum, there was the drawing table. Before the drawing table, there was a young man in Siberia who loved insects in the way that certain people love things, completely and without apology for their whole lives. Viktor Grebennikov drew insect wings with a fine brush for decades. He built a museum from specimens he collected himself, by hand, across a vast and cold country. He spent 40 years paying closer attention to the natural world than most people ever will. And then, late in his life, he wrote something extraordinary, something that no one who read it has been able to fully explain or fully dismiss. His legitimate contributions to entomology and natural history in Siberia do not require anti-gravity to be interesting. The museum was real, the drawings were real, the decades of fieldwork across a region not well studied by Western science were real. Those things touched other people's lives. Those things remain. The platform has never been found. No one who knew him saw it fly. No controlled experiment has reproduced the cavity structural effect. The evidence, all of it, points in the same uncomfortable direction. But Viktor Grebennikov looked at a beetle shell under a microscope and felt something push back. That is where this story begins. And it is, in some honest way, where it ends. Not with certainty, not with a solved mystery, with a question that the evidence cannot close. Was he a misunderstood genius who found something real and left too little behind to prove it? Or was he a brilliant observer whose desire to have found something extraordinary finally outran what the evidence could carry? No one has ever recreated his machine. No one has ever explained his flights. No one has ever found the proof. What disappeared was never the man. What disappeared was the answer. And 23 years after his death, it has not come back. If this kind of story is what you came here for, real people, real mysteries, no easy answers, subscribe. There are more where this came from. The pattern. Nobody warns you about. There is a specific kind of story that the internet tells about scientists. It has a structure, a real person, a real career, a genuine body of legitimate work, and then layered on top of it, a single, extraordinary claim that the evidence cannot support. You have seen this pattern before. even if you have not named it. Nikola Tesla's actual contributions to electrical engineering were enormous and documented. He also became a vessel, after his death, for almost every claim about suppressed energy technology that ever needed a famous name attached to it. Royal Raymond Rife genuinely conducted microscopy research in the 1930s. He also became the center of cancer cure narratives that his documented work did not support. The pattern is consistent. Real credentials provide the scaffolding on which extraordinary claims are hung. Grebennikov fits this pattern closely. That is not an accusation. It is a description of why his story spread the way it did, and why it continues to circulate today. The genuine credentials are not incidental to the appeal. They are the engine of it. A story about a random person who claims to have built an anti-gravity platform in their garden shed is easy to dismiss in 30 seconds. A story about a trained researcher at a Soviet scientific institute, a man who spent 40 years learning to see things in the natural world that others missed, who then reported something extraordinary from deep inside that lifetime of expertise. That story is not dismissed in 30 seconds. That story lingers. And here is the thing nobody says out loud: it should linger. The question of whether Grebennikov found something real is not a stupid question. Science has blind spots. Institutions do resist ideas that threaten existing frameworks. The history of discovery contains genuine examples of correct observations that were ignored, mocked, or suppressed before they were eventually vindicated. Semmelweis was ridiculed for proposing that doctors should wash their hands. Continental drift was dismissed as fantasy for decades. Being wrong about a claim is not the same as proving the claim false. The honest engagement with Grebennikov's story is not to laugh at it and not to believe it. It is to ask, where is the evidence? And to sit with the answer that there is none. That is a harder place to sit than either certainty offers. Why the Soviet setting matters. Part of what makes Grebennikov's story so durable and so easy to misread is the setting. The Soviet Union is not a neutral backdrop. It is a space that carries its own atmosphere of genuine secrecy, genuine suppression, and genuine hidden knowledge. The Cold War produced real classified programs. Entire branches of Soviet science were hidden from the West for decades. Biopreparat, the Soviet biological weapons program, operated in facilities disguised as pharmaceutical companies. The Soviet space program made announcements only after its missions succeeded, hiding its failures from the world. Soviet military research produced technologies that the West did not learn about for 20 or 30 years after they were developed. The suppression of information in the Soviet Union was not a conspiracy theory. It was institutional policy, applied systematically across every domain the state considered strategically sensitive. This historical reality exists, and it is important. It is also exactly what makes the Grebennikov narrative so easy to misapply, because there is a critical difference, and it is not a subtle one, between the documented suppression of strategic military technology by a state with clear security reasons to protect it, and the claimed suppression of a revolutionary anti-gravity device developed by a civilian entomologist at an agricultural research institute. If the Soviet state had detected that a bug scientist in Novosibirsk had built a working anti-gravity platform, the response would not have been to ignore it. The Soviet military-industrial complex did not ignore breakthroughs in propulsion and aerospace. It classified them, funded them, scaled them, and turned them into weapons programs. There is no record of any such program connected to Grebennikov. No classification documents, no military interest, no paper trail of any kind. The most logical reading of that absence is not that the suppression was perfect. It is that there was nothing to suppress. But that reading requires sitting with the absence, which is harder than it sounds. What a real discovery would have left behind. Let's think clearly about what a genuine anti-gravity discovery would look like. What it would necessarily produce, even if the person who made it tried to keep it quiet. A working device that counteracted gravitational force would have been detectable. Gravity is not subtle. Changes to local gravitational fields can be measured with instruments that already existed in Soviet scientific institutions in the 1980s. If a platform capable of silently lifting a human being were operating in the fields outside Novosibirsk, that operation would have produced measurable signatures. A working device would have attracted attention from anyone who witnessed it. Grebennikov described flying at low altitude, a few meters to a few hundred meters, over fields and forests. Low-altitude flight, even silent flight, even brief flight is visible. People look up. People talk about what they see. Not a single person from the Novosibirsk region came forward during Grebennikov's lifetime or after his death to describe witnessing this. A working device would have left engineering traces, not necessarily complete schematics. A man working alone might keep his methods in his head, but the materials he described, chitinous beetle wing cases collected in sufficient quantity to power a human-carrying platform, would have required acquisition on a significant scale. Insects at that scale, storage, preparation. No one at the Institute describes seeing any of this. A real discovery, even a hidden one, leaves edges. It touches the world at points of contact that leave marks. Grebennikov's platform, if it existed, left none of the marks a real device would leave. That is not proof it did not exist, but it is the shape of what we are looking at when we look at the evidence, and that shape is worth naming clearly. The legacy he left that no one argues about here is something that gets lost in every Grebennikov video, every forum thread, every breathless retelling of the platform story. The man had a real body of work that does not require any of this to be interesting. His Natural History Museum in Novosibirsk was a genuine institution. The specimens he collected across Siberia, pinned insects, pressed plants, preserved animals, geological samples gathered by hand over 40 years of fieldwork, represented a real contribution to the scientific record of a region not well documented by Western science during the Soviet era. His artistic illustrations of insect anatomy were precise enough to function as scientific reference material. His field observations of insect behavior contributed to agricultural science in ways that are not dramatic enough to become YouTube content, but that were real contributions to knowledge. He was, in the domain where he spent most of his professional life, a serious and dedicated observer of the natural world. That is not a consolation prize. That is a life's work. The platform has not been found, the schematics have not surfaced, the witnesses have not come forward. These facts are not going to change. But the museum was real. The drawings were real. The 40 years of fieldwork were real. Viktor Grebennikov paid close attention to the natural world for his entire adult life. And that attention produced things that touched other people's lives, and that remain in archives, in collections, in the record of science in Siberia, after everything else has been argued about and set aside. What he found in the insect world through patient, legitimate science was genuinely remarkable. What he claimed to have built from that knowledge remains unverified. Both of those things are true at the same time. Holding both of them honestly, without collapsing one into the other, without letting the extraordinary claim erase the real achievement, or the real achievement excuse the unverified claim, is the only way to see him clearly. It is also, maybe, the most interesting way to see him. Not as a fraud, not as a suppressed genius, as a man who spent his life looking closely at the world and who, near the end of that life, believed he had seen something that would change everything and could not prove it. That is a human story, one worth sitting with